The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at an excavation site just south of Jerusalem. Archaeologists say those scrolls contain biblical texts.
Dozens of fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls were just found in a cave.
For 70 years, one tiny fragment of ancient parchment defied every attempt to read it. Burned, blackened, and nearly erased by time, it sat in storage, silent and invisible to the human eye. Scholars catalogued it, photographed it, and moved on, convinced its secrets were lost forever. But in 2025, artificial intelligence returned what humans could not. Feeding on centuries of language, script, and scribal patterns, the machine peeled back layers of destruction and decay, and finally, the fragments spoke. What emerged was not prophecy or myth. It was a warning, a record of betrayal, disaster, and the collapse of a civilization that the writer foresaw long before it happened. And now, 2,000 years later, its message resonates again.
Almost 2,000 years. Gianluca Del Mastro is one of 6 papyrologists.
What did they know that we have forgotten? And why does their warning feel eerily relevant today? The Forgotten Library in the Desert Caves. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls begins with an accident. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed Deeb was searching for a lost goat in the rocky hills near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He wandered into a cave, threw a stone into the darkness to check if his animal was hiding inside, and heard something unexpected: the sound of breaking pottery. What he found inside that cave would become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. Clay jars, sealed for nearly 2,000 years, containing leather scrolls wrapped in linen and preserved by the bone-dry desert air. The shepherd had no idea that he had just stumbled upon an ancient library. Over the following years, archaeologists searched the surrounding cliffs systematically. They found 11 caves containing manuscript fragments, tens of thousands of pieces ranging from complete scrolls to scraps no larger than a fingernail. The collection was staggering in its scope. There were biblical manuscripts predating any previously known copies by 1,000 years, proving that the texts we read today have remained remarkably stable across millennia. There were sectarian writings describing the beliefs and practices of the community that likely created the library, detailed rules about ritual purity, communal meals, and preparation for a cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness. There were hymns of stunning beauty, commentaries on prophetic books, and legal codes governing every aspect of daily life. But who wrote these scrolls? The question has fueled decades of scholarly debate. The dominant theory connects them to the Essenes, a Jewish sect known from ancient sources as strict, disciplined, and deliberately isolated from mainstream society. The ruins of a settlement called Qumran sit near the caves, and many scholars believe this was where the Essenes lived and copied their sacred texts. Others argue that the scrolls came from multiple groups, that the caves served as a shared hiding place during times of danger, possibly when Roman armies threatened the region. Whatever the truth, the community that created this library took their beliefs with absolute seriousness. They lived in expectation of imminent divine judgment, convinced that they were living in the final days before a great transformation of the world. Among the thousands of fragments recovered from those caves, most could eventually be read using traditional methods or early imaging technology. But a small number resisted every attempt at decipherment. They were too burned, too faded, too damaged by time, humidity, insects, and the careless handling that plagued the collection in its early years. These impossible fragments were catalogued and stored, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. One fragment in particular became almost legendary among Dead Sea Scroll researchers. Its surface was so darkened that no light could penetrate. Its ink had degraded beyond what any imaging system could recover. Scholars examined it periodically, hoping that advances in technology might finally crack its silence. For 70 years, it kept its secrets. And then the machines learned to read. The science of reading the impossible. To understand what the AI accomplished, you need to understand what made this fragment so impossibly difficult to read. The parchment itself had darkened to nearly the same color as the ink. This meant that traditional imaging—
What is the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, so before 1947, our best Hebrew manuscripts came from about 1000 AD.
which works by detecting contrast between writing and background, found almost nothing to detect. The ink had degraded so severely that even where letters once existed, the chemical traces had faded below the threshold of visibility for any conventional camera. Physical examination was out of the question because the parchment was so fragile that handling it risked destroying whatever remained. Every previous attempt at reading had failed, not because scholars lacked skill or dedication, but because the information simply wasn't accessible to human senses or standard technology. The breakthrough came through a convergence of multiple AI technologies working in concert. The first was handwriting analysis trained on thousands of other Dead Sea Scroll fragments. By studying how ancient scribes formed each letter, the system learned to recognize partial strokes, pressure variations, and spacing patterns that indicated where writing had once existed, even when the ink itself was gone. The second technology was ink reconstruction, a machine learning model trained to understand how carbon-based ink spreads on parchment and how it degrades over time. This allowed the system to extrapolate from the faintest chemical traces, reconstructing strokes that appeared to human eyes as nothing more than slightly darker patches on an already dark surface. Neural networks specialized in linguistic prediction added another layer of capability. Ancient Hebrew and Aramaic follow consistent grammatical patterns, phrase structures, and vocabulary conventions. When the AI could identify even a few letters with confidence, it could predict what words and sentences were most likely to follow based on patterns learned from the entire corpus of Dead Sea Scroll texts. This wasn't guessing. It was probability calculation informed by deep familiarity with how ancient scribes actually wrote. The system would propose multiple possible reconstructions and rank them by likelihood, allowing human scholars to evaluate which made the most sense in context. The final technology was three-dimensional surface mapping. Even when ink has completely vanished, the act of writing with a reed pen leaves physical impressions in parchment, tiny grooves, compressed fibers, microscopic ridges that survive long after the ink has disappeared. By scanning the fragment at extremely high resolution and mapping these surface variations, the AI could trace the paths where a pen had traveled 2,000 years ago. Combined with the other technologies, this created a multi-layered approach to reconstruction. The system wasn't just looking at the fragment, it was reading its history, recovering information embedded in the physical structure of the parchment itself. When all these technologies worked together on the impossible fragment, something remarkable happened. Words began to emerge from what had seemed like total darkness. The first words to emerge from darkness. Researchers expected very little when they initiated the AI analysis. The fragment had defeated every previous attempt at reading. Most scholars assumed that even with advanced technology, only scattered letters might be recoverable, perhaps not enough to form meaningful words. What emerged instead sent quiet shockwaves through the academic community. The AI didn't just find letters, it reconstructed clusters of words, fragments of sentences, enough to identify the type of text and begin understanding its message. The fragment wasn't random administrative notes or a damaged copy of a known biblical book. It was something else entirely, something that matched no other document in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. The first surprise was the vocabulary. Several words that appeared in the reconstructed text were extremely rare, found in only one or two other manuscripts across the entire ancient corpus. These weren't common Hebrew terms that any scribe might use. They were specialized language, the kind that appears in texts dealing with unusual subjects like apocalyptic visions, cosmic warfare, or esoteric teachings reserved for inner circles. The presence of these rare terms immediately signaled that the fragment contained something out of the ordinary, something the original writer considered important enough to express in language that distinguished it from everyday religious writing. The second surprise was the handwriting itself. When the AI compared the letter formations against its database of known scribal hands from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it found no match. The angles were slightly different, the spacing unconventional, certain flourishes appeared that were absent from other manuscripts. This meant the fragment was written by a scribe whose work appeared nowhere else in the collection, someone operating outside the main scribal tradition of the Qumran community. Who was this unknown writer? Were they a member of a different group whose texts rarely survived? Were they a lone voice recording thoughts that others in the community might have considered dangerous or controversial? The handwriting analysis raised questions that the text itself would begin to answer. As more words emerged from the reconstruction, scholars began identifying the genre of the text. Three possibilities presented themselves. The first was an apocalyptic rule, a document describing preparations for cosmic conflict between forces of good and evil.
Astronomically brutal, but it was secular, so it did maintain the Christian population.
Similar to the famous war scroll found in the caves decades earlier. The second possibility was a community warning, a text meant to guide members through dangerous times by urging specific behaviors and attitudes. The third was a prophetic or visionary account, the kind of text that describes symbolic images, dreams, or messages believed to come from divine sources. Elements of all three genres seemed present, which itself was unusual. Most Dead Sea Scroll texts fit neatly into established categories. This one seemed to blend them in ways that suggested its author was working with urgent, unconventional material. The warning that made scholars shudder. When the full scope of the reconstructed text became clear, the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a hymn of praise or a list of community regulations. It was a warning, urgent and specific, written by someone who believed catastrophe was approaching and wanted their community to understand what was coming. The voice in the text spoke of danger drawing near day by day, of pressures building from outside forces, of a world that was fracturing in ways that would soon become impossible to repair. Every line carried weight, a desperate attempt to communicate something the writer believed was critically important. The first category of warnings concerned external threats. Several reconstructed phrases matched the linguistic patterns used in other texts that scholars believe reference Roman power. The fragment appeared to describe an expanding force that consumed everything in its path, a pressure that communities throughout the region could feel growing stronger. This fits perfectly with what we know about the historical period. Rome's grip on Judea tightened steadily during the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, leading eventually to open revolt and devastating military response. The writer of this fragment seems to have sensed this trajectory years or decades before the worst arrived. The second category concerned internal divisions. This is where the text becomes most unsettling. The writer warned not just about enemies outside the community, but about betrayal from within. Phrases emerged describing people who stood close but brought ruin, who weakened walls of trust from inside, who wore the appearance of loyalty while serving other purposes. This level of suspicion and fear was unusual even for the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls, which generally emphasized unity and shared commitment. Whoever wrote this fragment believed their community was being undermined from within, that the danger wasn't only foreign armies, but people among them who couldn't be trusted. The third category pointed toward specific catastrophes. One of the most discussed reconstructed lines described a city that would be burned and divided. Another mentioned a breach in the sanctuary, a phrase that could refer to violation of sacred spaces. These weren't vague, mystical predictions. They read like observations from someone watching their society crack apart, someone who understood that the tensions they were witnessing would eventually explode into destruction. And here's what shook scholars most deeply. The catastrophes described in the fragment actually happened. Jerusalem was burned in 70 CE. The temple was destroyed.
I believe that. And in 70 AD, when the Romans conquered the city and burned down the temple,
the community at Qumran was overrun and abandoned. The writer of this fragment predicted disasters that historical records confirm occurred within decades of when the text was likely written. What the ancient writer actually saw. So what was really happening when this fragment was written? To understand the warning, we need to understand the world the writer inhabited. The final centuries before the Common Era and the first century of it were times of extraordinary pressure in the region we now call Israel and Palestine. Foreign empires had dominated the area for generations. First the Greeks, then their successors, finally the Romans. Local populations lived under constant awareness that their fate was controlled by powers they couldn't influence. Taxes flowed outward to distant capitals. Foreign soldiers walked their streets. Traditional ways of life were under constant pressure to conform to outside expectations. But the pressure wasn't only external. Jewish society itself was fragmenting into competing factions with radically different visions of how to respond to their circumstances. The Sadducees, centered around the temple priesthood, favored accommodation with Roman power as the practical path to survival. The Pharisees emphasized strict observance of religious law as the way to maintain identity under foreign rule. The Essenes, likely connected to the Qumran community, withdrew from mainstream society entirely, believing that corruption had infected even the temple itself. Zealots advocated armed resistance, willing to risk everything in hope of divine intervention. These weren't abstract theological disagreements. They were matters of life and death, and tensions between these groups sometimes erupted into actual violence. The fragment's warnings about internal betrayal make perfect sense in this context. The writer wasn't being paranoid. They were observing a society where people genuinely couldn't trust each other, where your neighbor might report you to authorities, where factions spied on each other, where community bonds were dissolving under pressure. The language about people who stood close but brought ruin describes a real phenomenon in a world where survival sometimes required betraying former friends. The writer saw their society eating itself from within and understood that this internal decay made external conquest almost inevitable. Economic hardship added another layer of pressure. The decades before Jerusalem's destruction saw repeated famines, heavy taxation, and widespread poverty. The fragment contains phrases that scholars interpret as references to hunger and breakdown of order, language that matches historical records of shortages and economic collapse in the region. When people are hungry and desperate, social bonds fracture more easily. Violence becomes more likely. Trust disappears. The writer of this fragment was documenting a world in systemic crisis, where every institution that once provided stability was failing simultaneously. The preservation of lost voices. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived for 2,000 years because of an accident of geography and a desperate act of faith. The caves near Qumran offered conditions that no museum could replicate: extreme dryness that prevented bacterial decay, stable temperatures that stopped chemical degradation, total darkness that protected fragile inks from fading. The people who carried their sacred library into those caves probably believed they were hiding them temporarily, protecting their most precious texts during a moment of danger, with every intention of returning once the threat had passed. They wrapped the scrolls in linen, sealed them in clay jars, and walked away into a world that was about to collapse around them. They never came back. Roman armies swept through the region during the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 CE with devastating efficiency. The Qumran settlement was destroyed, its buildings burned, its inhabitants killed or scattered to the winds. Anyone who knew about the hidden caves either died in the violence or fled so far they could never return. The scrolls waited in darkness while centuries passed above them. Empires rose and fell. Religions spread and transformed. Languages evolved beyond recognition. The descendants of those who hid the library forgot it ever existed. Generation after generation, the parchment sat in silence, preserving words that no living person knew were there. 2,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time, yet the desert kept its promise. The voices remained, waiting for someone to finally listen. When the scrolls were finally discovered in the 20th century, the handling was nothing short of catastrophic. Early scholars had no protocol for preserving such impossibly fragile materials. They were academics, not conservators, and their excitement to read the texts overwhelmed any caution about protecting them. Fragments were stored in rooms with uncontrolled humidity that caused parchment to warp and crack. Scholars used adhesive tape to hold broken pieces together, not realizing that the chemicals in the tape would eat into the ancient material and cause irreversible damage. Some fragments were passed around to collectors like trading cards, disappearing into private hands where they deteriorated in conditions far worse than any climate-controlled archive. Pieces were lost entirely. Others crumbled to dust before anyone could photograph them. The fragment that AI finally decoded in 2025 was a survivor of this careless period. A piece so damaged by the combination of ancient wear and modern mishandling that nobody believed it could ever be read. Its surface had darkened to near black, possibly from exposure to fire at some point in its history, possibly from chemical reactions during improper storage. Its ink had faded below the threshold of visibility for any camera technology available at the time. Scholars examined it periodically over the decades, hoping that advances in imaging might eventually penetrate its silence. Each time, they walked away disappointed. The fragment became almost legendary among Dead Sea Scroll researchers, a symbol of knowledge that might be permanently lost despite sitting right in front of them. What makes the AI recovery so significant extends far beyond this single fragment. It demonstrates that similar techniques could work on other impossible manuscripts scattered across the world's archives. There are still pieces in the Dead Sea Scroll collection that have never been read, scraps too burned or faded or damaged for any previous technology to decipher. If machine learning can extract meaningful text from parchment that appeared completely blank to human eyes, then the library hidden in those caves may still contain messages we haven't yet heard. The decoded fragment might be just the beginning, the first voice recovered from a chorus that has been silent for 2 millennia. Other ancient collections face similar challenges and could benefit from the same approach. The carbonized scrolls from Herculaneum, buried when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, have resisted reading for centuries. They were literally baked into lumps of charcoal, their pages fused together, their ink indistinguishable from the blackened papyrus. Traditional methods of unrolling them destroyed more text than they revealed. But if AI can read pressure marks and chemical traces invisible to human senses, those scrolls might finally yield their secrets. We know they contain philosophical works, possibly including texts by Epicurus and other ancient thinkers whose writings were thought completely lost. An entire library of Greek philosophy might be waiting for the right technology to unlock it. Monastery archives across the Middle East, Ethiopia, and the Caucasus hold thousands of manuscripts that have never been properly studied because traditional methods cannot penetrate their deterioration. Palimpsests.
Palimpsest is when the old inscription on a parchment paper or on a parchment is erased and is overwritten with a new text.
Manuscripts where original text was scraped away so the parchment could be reused hide earlier writings beneath their visible surfaces. Damaged codices from the early Christian period might contain gospel variants or theological debates that would reshape our understanding of how the religion developed. Every archive, every collection, every forgotten storage room might contain voices waiting to speak, if only we develop the tools to hear them. The technology that unlocked the Dead Sea Scroll fragment represents something larger than a single archaeological breakthrough. It represents a fundamental shift in our relationship with the past. For centuries, we accepted that time destroys information irreversibly, that decay eventually wins, that some ancient voices are simply gone forever. The AI recovery challenges that assumption. It suggests that information persists in ways we didn't previously understand, encoded in physical structures and chemical traces that survive long after visible writing has vanished. The voices of the past haven't necessarily been silenced. They've been waiting, patient and persistent, for technology sophisticated enough to finally hear what they've been trying to tell us all along. The Fragment, decoded in 2025, proves that listening is finally becoming possible. The question now is, how many other voices are out there, buried in damaged parchment and blackened papyrus, ready to speak after millennia of enforced silence? Why this warning still matters. Here's what makes the Decoded fragment more than an academic curiosity. The warning it contains doesn't feel ancient. Strip away the specific references to Rome and Jerusalem and the Temple, and what remains is a description of social collapse that could have been written yesterday. A society fragmenting into hostile factions that can't trust each other, external pressures exploiting internal divisions, economic hardship pushing people toward desperation, traditional institutions failing to provide stability, leadership unable or unwilling to address gathering dangers. The writer of this fragment documented the symptoms of a civilization in terminal decline, and those symptoms look disturbingly familiar. The fragment's emphasis on internal betrayal carries particular resonance. The writer wasn't primarily worried about foreign armies. They were worried about people within their own community who couldn't be trusted, about factions more interested in fighting each other than facing shared threats. They saw their society consuming itself through suspicion, recrimination, and unwillingness to cooperate even when cooperation was the only path to survival. This is the dynamic that destroys civilizations more reliably than any external enemy. Internal cohesion fails, and everything else follows. What the ancient writer couldn't have known was that their warning would be buried for 2,000 years and decoded by a machine in an era facing its own set of existential pressures. Climate instability, political polarization, economic inequality, technological disruption, institutional failure. The list of contemporary challenges sometimes feels as overwhelming as what that ancient community faced. The fragment doesn't offer solutions. It offers recognition. It says, "We saw this coming. We tried to warn our people. We failed to prevent it." The question it poses across the centuries is whether we will do any better. For 2,000 years, that fragment waited in silence, its warning ignored, its words invisible, its message buried beneath time and dust. Now, for the first time, we can hear it. But hearing is not the same as understanding. What else lies hidden in the remnants of lost civilizations, waiting for the right tools, or the right eyes, to bring it back to light? Are we listening closely enough, or are we destined to repeat the same mistakes that erased those voices in the first place? The past has been patient, but it has never been silent. The AI has unlocked a warning once thought lost, but the question remains, will we heed it before it's too late? And what other messages from the shadows of history are still waiting for someone to listen?